things begin to get real at this stage. So at this point, it's not just something that the man has encountered. It's something the man is now choosing, oftentimes again and again, against significant pressure, sometimes ridicule, and in some extreme cases, persecution. He's fighting for territory in the man's mind. Old frameworks in the man's mind is resisting this new truth that is coming to him. People around the man are resisting this truth, and the man must decide, oftentimes repeatedly, whether this truth he's holding is worth the cost he's having to pay for holding it. He just could not see people living under the bondage of oppression and then not say anything about it. So he said, is this woman not a daughter of Abraham? I know you don't agree with me healing on the Sabbath, but you bloody brood of vipers. So does it mean that silence is always an evidence of not having truly arrived at this point of possession of truth? Or does it mean that when a man is silent as concerning things that are contrary to him, the man is either wicked or has not exactly arrived at the knowledge of truth in its deepest form? We need to hold this compulsion argument pretty carefully, because the compulsion at level 3 is not specifically a compulsion to speak, but rather a compulsion to be true. I believe so. Right? Speech is just one expression of that desire to be true, and oftentimes is the most powerful expression, but it's not the only one. We must be honest about this serious challenge, because everything described above, the compulsion, the firing, the bones rhetoric, the inability to stay silent, can be equally said of a man possessed by falsehood he has mistaken for truth. Now, zealotry does not self-identify. The fanatic indeed feels exactly what the prophet feels. Conviction in the rightness of one's cause is not by itself evidence that that cause is right. So really, how do we distinguish a man possessed by truth from a man possessed by sincere but false conviction? Okay, so today we'll be talking about the question I believe doesn't get asked enough, and it's the question of what exactly it means for a man to know truth, right? Not just to have heard it, not just to agree with it in a spontaneous moment of clarity, but to actually know it, right? In a way that it actually changes him. It actually changes who the man is, not just merely what he thinks. And this question, I believe, is not as simple as it sounds, because we can oftentimes move through life carrying a collection of beliefs, persuasions, convictions that we are convinced about without seriously examining whether these beliefs that we are convinced are ours have actually taken deep roots in us, or if they are simply just dwelling on the surface of our minds, right? This difference oftentimes matter more than we tend to admit it. It's a wide space between a man who just has mental assent to a truth and a man who has actually embodied that truth. And it begins with recognizing really that man's interaction with truth is not just static. It is something that evolves, something that grows through levels. And the 3 levels of a man's encounter, a man's interaction with truth, is what we'll be going through. So the first level is the level of exposure, right? Level 1, right? This, where a man first encounters truth. He hears something, he reads something, that door opens, and voila, light shines on his face, right? But at this point, the truth is still external to this man, as it were. So he can describe it, he can repeat it, he could tell it to someone. In some cases, he can really feel deeply moved by this truth. But at this point, the truth that this man has encountered is yet to demand anything of him. It is just that first phase of introduction. And really, there's nothing wrong with that, because in the end, every deep conviction starts at that point of introduction. You cannot get to a point of deep conviction without exposure. I mean, scriptures talk about how can men believe if there's no preacher, right? So the first point of a man's interaction with the truth is exposure. But the danger in this level sometimes can be the tendency to mistake this for the entire journey, right? So as people, we can live entirely on this level 1, collecting ideas we find compelling, but holding this truth loosely, moving on when we find the next compelling idea, because really the truth that we thought we received was just a visitor. It never really moved in with us, right? So the truth we believed in never really lived with us. Okay, enough of that. So in the end, you really don't want to mistake that first feeling of awakening in your mind to you having come to a certain depth of knowledge of the truth, right? You must understand that your interaction with truth is not static, it grows through levels, right? And it's from here that we'll move to the second level, which I would call the level of conviction, right? Truth fighting for territory. I think this is level 2. And this second level is where things get serious and where the serious work begins, right? Things begin to get real at this stage. So at this point, it's not just something that the man has encountered, it's something the man is now choosing, oftentimes again and again, against significant pressure, sometimes ridicule, and in some extreme cases, persecution, right? So there's this slow erosion of social belonging that comes from holding an unpopular opinion, right? And that point where levels of interior war begin to happen, right? The truth is fighting for territory in the man's mind. Old frameworks in the man's mind is resisting this new truth that is coming to him. People around the man are resisting this truth, and the man must decide, oftentimes repeatedly, whether this truth he's holding is worth the cost he's having to pay for holding it, right? Is this thing I'm holding worth living for? Is it worth dying for, right? And this is where conviction in the man's heart is forged, not just in that moment of initial encounter, which we spoke about, phase 1, but in that sustained choice to remain aligned with this thing I've come to interact with, this thing I've encountered. I'm making that sustained, repeated choice to remain aligned with what I believe to be real. And this level is what produces something I would say is genuinely admirable. It produces that man that does not fold under pressure, right? Conviction is forged in the man at this field, but I do not see this in some form as the final destination. I see a level 3, which is basically the level of possession, where truth or this ideology that the man is interacting with now becomes an internal structure, right? This third level, I believe, is qualitatively different from the first two. It is not just simply a deeper level of conviction of a truth you've been exposed to. This level is a transformation of who the man is in his deep self. At this level, truth has stopped being something the man holds on to, right? Truth now becomes something holds on to the man. I'm not trying to be deep here, right? Truth has actually formed an internal structure in this man. The man's reflexes, his intuitions, his instinctive responses, the way he sees the world is being shaped by this ideology he has chosen repeatedly to embody. So the man does not first think about truth or this ideology of truth and then now decides after thought to act accordingly. The truth simply just moves through the man's action because the man has embodied or has now become the commandments, as it were, or the truth he has interacted with. So truth at this point becomes the man's native language, right? And great witnesses throughout history have shown this level of interaction, which we see it. We see this level of interaction or this level of possession of a man by truth. We see it in the prophets, the reformers, and moral exemplars. They share a common quality whereby we see that these men do not appear to be exercising willpower in their living for truth or living in truth, but rather they seem to be walking from a standpoint of necessity, where it's not just them trying to push truth, but more of like truth pushing them to take the actions we saw them take. So we see the prophet Jeremiah in numerous points complaining about the troubles he's facing in communicating the things God has spoken to him, right? To see him talk about, I'm not doing again, I've had enough, right? But just in the next moment, to see him talk about him not being able to hold back, about this truth being like fire in his bones. And obviously we saw him go on and on with that, despite pushing against the grain of what the men in his time believed to be true, right? It was just like fire shot in his bones, as he put it, and he just could not resist it, right? We see similar thing in Martin Luther, who knew what the institutional church could do to him at that point, because the church then was not just a religious structure, right? They also had quite significant political power, right? But he spoke either ways, right? And at this point, the men who have gotten to this level cannot be stopped by the same reasoning that might stop a man who is just deeply convinced or deeply convicted about something. These men have now been possessed. So see a man like Jesus move through rejection, hostility without pausing or adjusting his course. And it was not just It didn't take on the form of a brave performance or trying to put on an act. It was just them simply being themselves, right? It was just, as it were, the truth that had possessed them shining through them. So they became sort of like vessels now possessed by the truth that they spoke about. And it's at this level, I believe, that truth becomes a man's burden in the most important sense, in that this truth or this burden of truth that now rests on the man is not a weight that crushes him, but rather a weight or a burden that gives the man some sense of orientation and direction for his life. So the man begins to see with an unusual clarity the disorientation of the people around him that are living without this truth that has set him free. So the compassion that wells up in the man's heart from seeing the contrariness or seeing the depth of darkness that people who are not aligning with his truth are in, it just stirs up a compassion within him that is not manufactured. It's a compassion that is from a structure that comes from within, right? So it arises because this man has become so aligned with truth that he cannot move in a place where men are in misalignment with truth without feeling it. So you see multiple times scriptures talk about Jesus beholding the crowd, seeing it as, a bunch of sheep without shepherd, and then he's moved with compassion. He begins to teach them. You see him, as it were, complaining, not complaining in the sense of complaining, but venting in some sense that Jerusalem, oh Jerusalem, that kills the prophet. How often will I have gathered your children like a hen gathers her brood, but you would not love me. Therefore, I'm leaving your cities to you desolate. Right, so he just could not unsee it. He just could not see people living under the bondage of oppression and then not say anything about it. So he said, is this woman not a daughter of Abraham? I know you don't agree with me healing on the Sabbath, but you bloody brood of vipers. Right? He was not just trying to be a contrarian voice or trying to be an out of the person, but there's a truth that I embody that I cannot see misaligned and then just look at it. Now I'll be moving on to talk about the burden that this possession of truth brings on a man, and the compulsion that comes as a result of it. Because this framework raises a natural question that if a man has genuinely reached, there could be the question that if a man has genuinely reached this third level of embodiment of truth, that it would be impossible for that man to stay silent. So does it mean that silence is always an evidence of not having truly arrived at this point of possession of truth? Or does it mean that when a man is silent as concerning things that are contrary to him, the man is either wicked or has not exactly arrived at the knowledge of truth in its deepest form? Now, this compulsion argument is pretty compelling and there's some sort of truth to it, but a man truly possessed by truth indeed would feel an almost involuntary pressure to voice it, to embody it, and to represent this truth that he has embodied to the world. So the fire in the bones imagery is not just an exaggeration. It describes something real about what happens when a man comes upon a conviction that is just not merely intellectual. But we need to hold this compulsion argument pretty carefully, because the compulsion at level 3 is not specifically a compulsion to speak, but rather a compulsion to be true. I believe so, right? Speech is just one expression of that desire to be true. And oftentimes it's the most powerful expression, but it's not the only one. Right? To see Jesus standing before Pilate, completely silent. And his silence at that point was not cowardice. His silence at that point was not a lacking in the possession of truth in his being. In fact, as a matter of fact, in context, at that point of Jesus' silence was a full expression of his embodiment of truth. So wisdom about timing and audience is not cowardice. A man who is truly possessed by truth would also be possessed by the discernment that belongs to truth. right? So speaking, or that compulsion to speak, definitely is a powerful show of embodiment or possession by truth. But it's not always the case, right? What level 3 actually makes impossible for a man is comfortable compromise, right? The man at this level cannot pretend he does not see what he sees. The man at this level cannot perform allegiance to frameworks that he knows to be false by reason of the truth he has embodied. He cannot make peace with lies simply because the lies are socially convenient. In this sense, yes, genuine possession of truth makes a certain kind of silence impossible. Right. Now, there's a hard question. How exactly do we know the difference between a man who has been possessed by truth and a man who is just a radical fanatic or a zealot? Right? Because in this framework, we must be honest about this serious challenge, because everything described above, the compulsion, the firing, the bones rhetoric, the inability to stay silent, can be equally said of a man possessed by falsehood he has mistaken for truth. Now, zealotry does not self-identify. The fanatic indeed feels exactly what the prophet feels. Conviction in the rightness of one's cause is not by itself evidence that that cause is right. So really, how do we distinguish a man possessed by truth from a man possessed by sincere but false conviction? Because, yeah, a man can actually be strongly convinced in all honesty, right? But he's just honestly wrong, right? Honest, passionate, but just honestly wrong. So how exactly do we distinguish a man possessed by truth from a man either in falsehood all the way, or a man in honest falsehood, right? And there are 3 markers that I believe seem to matter, though in the end, we cannot entirely have 100% clean test, right? But I believe this 3 would do a lot of filter, right, for us. And the first, I believe, that distinguishes a man possessed by truth is humility before scrutiny. A man genuinely possessed by truth will tend to welcome serious challenge rather than to deflect it, right? Because he trusts that truth can survive pressure. He knows that if what he believes, or if what he carries, or if what he's carrying in his hand is true, he should be able to live up against pressure, right? So the man does not shy away from contrary arguments. The man does not shy away from scrutiny. In fact, the man welcomes it, because truth creates a purity in the heart of a man that he actually wants to stand for what is true, right? So this humility before scrutiny is different from performed openness, right? A sophisticated zealot can appear to consider objections while remaining fundamentally close to the objections he appears to be considering. Now, a more reliable test as regarding this scrutiny would be in a private setting, right? In a setting with no audience, no social performance required. In this setting now, does the man actually engage the challenge? Does it move him at all, right? Self-deception does not usually survive sustained private examination in an atmosphere of honest conversations, right? A second marker we could use to filter for the difference is the cost structure of the belief the man is holding on to. Genuine truth oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes tends to be inconvenient to the self. It asks something of the man that his ego would prefer to not give. Self-deception, by contrast, often runs in the direction of the self's needs. Self-deception protects identity, justifies anger, it provides community, and it confers some sort of significance. So when a man's deepest conviction happens to serve his psychological needs almost perfectly, then the alignment of that man to his said truth should a bit more be deeply examined. Right. Now, a third marker of truth, I believe, or a third marker of a man who is holding on to what he says is truth, should be historical coherence. Right. A truth that is real should connect to something that was true before the man arrived. There's nothing new under the sun. What has been is what will be. So truth is not exactly, or should not exactly in entirety be the innovation of one man. The great truth tellers of history were not novelties, they were continuations. So Jeremiah, who spoke of earlier, stood on Moses. Right? A lot of the proclamations Jeremiah spoke against his nation, as it were things Moses already spoke about, that in the day you deviate from your God would have all this go on for you. So Jeremiah stood on Moses. Moses, as it were, Moses' ministry stood pretty much on prophecy that was spoken to Abraham. Right? God had spoken to Abraham previously that his descendants will be in captivity for 400 years, and then after that they will be delivered, and then they would receive the land of promise, as it were. So Moses' ministry stood on the promise that God made to Abraham. Abraham stood on promises that had been made before him, in some sense. So we see, as it were, a prophecy that had gone before, right, as concerning the children of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, right? That, Canaan, which is the son of Ham, would be a servant to his brothers, right? Shem and Japheth. I will see Abraham as a descendant of Shem, right? I believe so. In some sense, that's speaking of God to Abraham as concerning the land of promise, which is the land of Canaan, kind of rests on the prophecy that had gone before Abraham, right? Even the man Martin Luther, we did not see him invent this challenge to the church. He simply opened the book, right, that already existed and read it plainly, right? So transhistorical backing for a claim is not proof of its truth, really, but the absence of transhistorical backing to a truth is a warning sign. A man who believes himself to be the sole originator of a truth that no one at all before him has had a glimpse, of, should be questioned carefully. Now, I'd like us to look at truth as law, right? The question of the ontological weight of truth. Now, beneath all of this lies a deeper question as to what exactly truth is. One way to think about it is this: truth is not merely a category of correct statements. I believe truth is structural, and it is woven into the fabric of what exists. In the same way as gravity does not require anyone's agreement to operate, and in the same way that seeds reliably become the plants they are seeds of, there are laws embedded in reality that enforce themselves regardless of what an individual believes about them or does not believe about them. So, in this view, a lie is not then simply an incoherent statement, but a claim that runs against the grain of what is actually real. And reality, giving enough time, push against this falsehood. And the lie will not bend reality to fit itself. Reality will not bend the lie. As long as there remains that misalignment to what is truth, reality will not bend to suit that lie, because it runs against the brain of what has been set as structuring existence. So structures built on falsehood or structures built on lies would eventually fracture, not because someone decides to tear them down, but because they were not exactly weight-bearing or load-bearing in the first place. They were not grounded on what is able to sustain. This helps explain something that lives in my mind about the staying power of truth carriers through history. It was not just willpower that sustained them. It was an alignment to something that had sustaining power on its own. So they were carrying something that had gravity in itself, something that would have continued being true regardless of whether they spoke it or not. So their speaking was not the source of the truth, but simply their response, having recognized that this indeed is truth and this is the fragment into what our existence has been weaved into. Now, this framework extends beyond physical laws that we can measure in labs, right? The laws of forgiveness, of discipline, of integrity, these cannot be proven by equations really, but can be observed in the accumulated weight of the human experience. Civilizations that built on these laws flourished, while those that systematically violated them eventually broke up. Not every pattern shows up in a single lifetime, which is precisely why the transhistorical view of truth matters. A man who can only see one generation of evidence is surely, verily working with insufficient data. So let's look at the foundation beneath this framework. So I believe it's worth being honest about where this framework ultimately rests. The claim that truth has ontological weight, that it's not merely human in its construct, but something embedded in the structure of existence, is not itself provable by the same methods that one would prove a scientific claim. It is foundational commitment. It's a foundational commitment, and it's the ground the framework stands on rather than something the framework itself can prove. Every serious framework has such an unmoving foundation. The question is not whether you have one. The question is not whether your framework has that foundation. The question is whether yours is coherent, whether it is livable, and whether it remains consistent with what the reality keeps showing us across time, across dispensations, across generations. The case for truth having ontological weight rests in part on the cumulative implausibility of coincidence, really. What are the odds of all of this being just a function of chance, right? The precision of our natural systems, the consistency with which certain moral principles produce flourishing and their violation produces fracture, the pattern across millennia of truth claims that prove themselves through history. These do not add up to a careful and honest observer to be mere accident. The convergence is too consistent and too costly to his messengers to be explained as self-interest or cultural transmission alone, in the case of wanting to toe that line of argument. So a man who has worked through all of this honestly, who has traced the evidence, examined the incentives of the people who carry this message or who have embodied or who have communicated these truths, a man who has submitted his convictions to genuine challenge and found that what he carries still holds, is in a way different position than the man who simply has a strong feeling. The man who holds truth, having gone through all of these processes, definitely is not certain in the way as a mathematical proof is certain, but he's not standing in mere assertion either. The man is standing on a ground that has been tested. So in conclusion, the weight of what we have to carry, or the weight of what we carry. The three-level framework of man's interaction with truth that we've set forth is ultimately a call to examine what kind of relationship we have with the truths we say to hold. Not whether we've heard them, nor whether we can articulate them, but whether they have taken up residence in us deeply enough to change who we are from the very essence or from the very root of ourself. A man at level 3 is not a man who has become more confident in his opinions, but a man who has been reorganized from the inside. The truth he carries has become his structure, his reflex, his way of seeing, and because of that, he cannot encounter people leading without it and not be moved. This compassion is not an add-on. It's a natural consequence of alignment with something that is at its core, or human flourishing. The burden of this knowledge is real. It's not comfortable to see clearly what others are missing. It's not easy to speak when the audience is hostile, indifferent, or just everywhere else apart from where you're heading. And it's definitely not simple to carry fire in your bones. But the man who is genuinely arrived at this level does not primarily experience it as a burden in a negative sense, but he experiences this weight of bearing and leading with this possession of truth as a weight that gives him direction. The truth has possessed him. And in this possession, the man has in the deepest sense of it become free. And having embodied this freedom, it is no wonder that the man, just like truth, desires deeply to settle as free as well.